Okay, we're going to take a stab at chapter number 11, personality chapter today. All nice and clean. Showered for the first time this week. It's Friday, but I've been in the pool for the last 3 days with my grandkids and didn't feel the need to shower, but finally needed to, and all clean and ready to do chapter 11. So this is a good chapter to cover early on. It's later on in the book, but I like to cover it early because it's a good kind of additional foundation for the major paradigms of psychology. So basically in this chapter we talk about the paradigms that we talked about in the last chapter. Actually, not the last chapter, the first chapter. The psychoanalytic paradigm, the humanistic paradigm, and the cognitive paradigm, and the behavioral paradigm in the form of how they view personality. All right, so first of all, personality is that thing that we think exists in people, that is the way that they normally act, that describes the way that they normally act and the way that they normally are across many different situations over time. It's that enduring quality in people that we tend to use to predict people's behavior, and tells us, in a sense, sometimes it can tell us whether we would like them or not. So first of all, again, we're going to talk about the psychodynamic or the psychoanalytic paradigm. Those two terms, I'll use them interchangeably throughout the semester. They pretty much can be used interchangeably. Most people do, but the psychodynamic term is probably more appropriately used for the overall theory, and in a sense it describes the dynamic interplay between the psychological elements of our personality that causes our personality. The psychoanalytical term is often used to describe the therapy. So obviously the psychodynamic or the psychoanalytic personality theory comes from the psychodynamic or the psychoanalytic paradigm. We're also in this chapter going to talk a little bit about the trait view. Now, the trait view isn't a paradigm. That term itself doesn't come to mind the name of a paradigm that we covered in chapter 1. But the trait view comes from the biological paradigm. So the trait view basically says that our personalities come from our genes. We inherit them from our parents, from our ancestors. And so they don't do a whole lot of, they don't have a whole lot of detail, or don't have a lot of intricate explanations for why we are the way we are. That simply comes from our genetic endowment from our parents. The humanistic view of personality comes from the humanistic paradigm. And remember, humanists want to believe that humans are basically good, that they emphasize our potential, they emphasize our free will and our ability to self-determine who we want to be. Humanists rebelled against both the psychoanalytic perspective, which basically said that we're animals, and the behavioral perspective that basically said that we're machines programmed by the environment. So the humanistic view, in terms of our personality, focuses on those elements. The social cognitive view of personality comes from a combination of the cognitive paradigm and the behavioral paradigm. It's the most scientific of the four personality theories that we'll cover in this chapter. Mostly it's more scientific because it focuses on the more concrete behaviors that we can manipulate and study more readily scientifically. And also it's more scientific because it focuses on cognitive processes, conscious cognitive processes as opposed to unconscious cognitive processes, and as opposed to the subjective feelings of the humanistic paradigm. Both the humanistic paradigm and the psychoanalytic paradigm would be considered less scientific than the cognitive and the behavioral paradigms, because what they study, unconscious processes and subjective feelings, are harder to measure All right, so we're going to spend most of our time talking about the psychodynamic paradigm and the trait perspective, but we'll have a little bit more to say about the other two perspectives toward the end of the chapter. So first of all, this picture doesn't seem all that exciting, but I kind of enjoy it. I kind of like it. The first time I went to the Freud Museum in London with a group of students in 2012, I saw this picture on the wall, and I noticed that it was it's a pen and ink drawing by Salvador Dali, and as you know, he's a famous world-renowned surrealist artist, and he visited Freud in the last year or two that he was alive in England, and apparently one of those times did this drawing for Freud, and I'm sure it's worth quite a bit of money, and it just happened to be hanging without a whole lot of fanfare in Freud's house, and I thought, wow, I got to take a picture of that. It's probably illegal to post it on the internet like this, but anyway, pretty amazing picture, I think, even though it's kind of interesting looking. So Freud was born in 1856, died in 1939. Notice that he died well before a major understanding of a lot of the biology of our natures. Well before our understanding of genetics. He didn't have the understanding then that we have now, so he was a little bit at a disadvantage. And it's easy now to criticize him today for having ideas that are pretty out there and not real substantiated by science, but it was partly because of the era that he was raised in. He was before we had a huge understanding of some of these things. But there are other reasons why people are critical of Freud. We'll get into that in a minute. Personally, I like Freud. I think the thing about Freud that I really like is that he makes you think. He always forces you to look at the underlying issues, the underlying processes in a person that might be responsible for a person's behavior that we may not readily see because they're so underlying and they're so hidden. So, as we said in chapter 1, the psychoanalytical paradigm and the psychoanalytical view of personality focuses primarily on the unconscious, hidden, unobservable, unmeasurable, and ultimately unknowable parts of our personality. We can never really know the unconscious. We can only infer it from a person's actions and the interpretations that an expert might put on those actions and the symbols of a person's life. So the unconscious is primarily made up of inborn tendencies. Remember, Freud said that we're basically animals with innate and overwhelmingly powerful sexual and aggressive drives. And most of what we do can be traced back to our animalistic tendencies in terms of self-preservation, self-love, and again, the aggression and the sexual instincts that are related to those. Freud also believed that the early years of one's life contribute substantially to our unconscious because we have all of these experiences and we can't communicate about them with other people. We don't have thought processes developed, conscious processes developed enough to be able to work through them. And so these experiences result in unconscious feelings and personality tendencies that will influence us for the rest of our lives. Now, I just want to relate that to something like learning how to walk and talk. So most of you have no, and all of you actually should not have any memories of learning how to walk and talk. If you think you have memories of those, you're lying to yourself. You're fooling yourself, because actually our memory processes that allow us to remember things long term and hold on to them for the rest of our lives probably are not really all that well developed until after the first 2 to 3 years of life. So it's really hard to remember things that may shape the rest of your life that occurred in the first few years of your life. And walking and talking are one of those things. You learned how to walk and talk, and you had no memories of the things that taught you those abilities, and yet you use no conscious memories of learning how to do those things, but you use and benefit from those memories every single day. So Freud's point is, just as we don't have any conscious memories of our past at a very young age that influence us in terms of being able to walk and talk today, we also have unconscious memories. No conscious memories, but we have unconscious memories of things that relate to how we were treated, whether we were neglected or loved this way or that way, that influence us today. So when you're in a relationship in your late teens or early 20s, and you tend to be a little clingy or not clinging at all, secure or insecure in that relationship, have a hard time feeling good about your partner when your partner hasn't texted you for the entire day or doesn't respond right away, or if you can handle that okay. All of those things are related to the way that you were treated and the way that you interacted with your parents from a very young age. So again, those kind of unconscious memories from way back then influence us today, just as the unconscious memories of learning how to walk and talk and other things as well. All right, so let's take a look at first of all, Freud talks about three major components of our personality. So the id is the part of our personality that's totally unconscious, and we're born with it. So when we're first born, all we are is an id, according to Freud. So the id is guided by what Freud called the pleasure principle. The id knows what it wants, and it wants it right now. It can't delay gratification. It can't strategize. It can't plan. Now, we think of the id as kind of the negative part, the animalistic, kind of the devil on your shoulder part of your personality. But as I just described it, it's really helpful to, instead of thinking of the id as your sinister, evil part of your personality, think of it as the infantile part of your personality. So the infant, the brand new infant within the first few months, doesn't have the ability to strategize or delay gratification, can't think logically or rationally, and knows what it wants and wants it right now. That's the epitome of an id personality. We all have that from birth, and we have it throughout the rest of our lives. But what happens as we get older, then other parts of our personality get added to that. So the ego develops, according to Freud, in the second half of the first year of life. Your brain, your thinking ability is developing a little more, and so it begins to have the ability to understand that you don't always get what you want. Sometimes when you want that bottle or the pacifier, or you want to be cuddled or hugged by your mom or your dad, it just doesn't happen. So you have to figure out a way to deal with that. So Freud said in order to deal with reality, the ego naturally develops out of the id. So the ego is guided by the reality principle. It's our logical thinking, rational thinking part of ourself that helps us to deal with the way that the world is, as opposed to the way that we would like it. Freud believed that in order to be a healthy individual, you have to have a dominant ego. Not necessarily a big ego, but you have to have an ego that is able to put the id into proper perspective, as well as the superego. So the superego is the third part of the personality to develop, and it is basically your internal parent, or your conscience. And often, the superego can be kind of a taskmaster, just as strong as the id, but in a different direction. So the id wants you to do the self-serving, pleasure-seeking thing. The superego wants to do the moral, ethical, right thing that your parents have taught you or society has taught you. And both of those drives can be pretty strong. Now, the first one is innate. The second one is learned. So Freud was an atheist. He didn't believe that morality was innate within anybody. It was totally learned through parents and the environment around you. But even so, it can be equally as strong in terms of a drive. And the ego's job is basically to satisfy the demands of both of those two extremes. Now, again, we can think of, although it's not completely correct, we can think of the angel as the devil on your shoulder. Excuse me, we can think of the id as the devil on your shoulder. We can think of the superego as the angel on your shoulder. They're both pushing you in different directions, and this ego's job is to mediate between those, to satisfy the demands of both of those in a way that keeps the whole person functioning appropriately without too much guilt, without too much anxiety or worry or any of those negative feelings that the ego is constantly trying to defend against. So Freud viewed the personality as an iceberg. It's kind of hard to see, but he thought that the personality was like an iceberg, mostly unconscious. There's just the tip of our personalities is conscious. Most of our personalities are underwater like an iceberg. So the id is totally unconscious. The ego is partially conscious and partially unconscious. And the superego is also partially conscious and unconscious. Notice that when you look at this on your own, you can see that the id comprises the major part of our personality. It's the biggest source of who we are and what we're all about. Now let's go back to the mediation tool or the mediation aspect of the ego. Picture a guy at the ATM. When you look at this on your own, you can see that the guys at the ATM need some cash out. So the angel on the shoulder is saying, the superego is saying, you only need $50. That's all you need. Just plenty. Just get that. But the devil, the id on your shoulder, is thinking about all the things you could do with more money, and so is telling you to get out 150. And what the ego has to do is decide, make a compromise, and maybe say, okay, superego, you want 50, id, you want 150, so I'm going to take out 100, satisfy the demands of both of you a little bit, but do it in a way that we can all get along. So I used to have this video when I was a much younger teacher where this kind of thing is depicted on a stage. And so on this stage, there's a young man sitting at this table. You can imagine it's like a library table, a table in the library or a table in the cafeteria at school. And this young man is sitting at this table, and he looks across the room and he sees this attractive young woman on another table. And he becomes attracted to her because she's nice looking. He thinks, and it'd be nice to get to know her, spend some time with her. And so as he's thinking about that a little bit, in this dramatization, from the left-hand darkened side of the stage, there's all this symbolism in the video. From the left-hand darkened side of the stage comes a young man looking like him, but dressed in a black tuxedo, but looking a little sinister and devilish. And he comes out, and he's panting, breathing heavily, and he's going, I want. And so you realize that represents this young man's id, and this id is basically telling him that he wants to sexually possess that young woman at the table. And while he's dealing with that impulse, that motivation coming in from the left side of the stage, after a while, from the right-hand side of the stage, from a fully lit right-hand side of the stage, comes a guy in a white tuxedo, and he's looking also like the guy at the table, but a little more angelic. He's looking like the devilish part of the personality as well, but this one's a little more angelic, and he's going, no, don't listen to him. He wants you to sexually possess that young woman over there, but you have to realize she represents your mother, and you would never think of having sex with your mom, right? So no, you can't go there at all. Remember what you learned in Sunday school and all that, what your parents taught you. So don't even go there. And so the guy at the table is being pushed and pulled by these two extremes of his personality. And so he says, okay, this is what we're going to do. sit down and we're going to talk about it. And so they go back and forth, and the id's pushing him to do this, and the superego's pushing him to do that. And he says, okay, finally, let's do this. Let's the three of us go over there. Let's talk to her, get to know her. We'll ask her out, and maybe it'll take a couple of times of seeing her at school and a couple of times to ask her out. Eventually, she'll say yes. We'll have a date, go on a date, have a good time, and eventually we'll get married. And so eventually we can have sex, and id, you'll get what you want, and superego, you'll get what you want, but we'll do it the right way, and we'll do it in the right way. So we're going to satisfy the demands of both of you. This is the way we're going to do it. So anyway, that video and the other example with the ATM is basically designed to help you to understand how Freud viewed our personality. It's a constant dynamic interaction between these pushes and pulls in our psyche, and our personality is the result of all those pushes and pulls. Most of the processes that go on are unconscious. We're not aware of them. We're aware of the end result. We're not often aware of all the arguments and the debates and the extreme pushes and pulls that are going on underneath the system, underneath the surface in our system. Now, another thing about Freud that I think is kind of interesting is he talks about defense mechanisms. And it was actually his daughter, Anna Freud, who developed most of these to a great extent, but Freud introduced these before he died. Defense mechanisms are often called ego defense mechanisms. They are used by the ego to defend against the worry and the anxiety and the tension and the conflicts that occur when these extremes of the personality, the id and the superego, are fighting it out. And when you go too far in the direction of one or the other, and the other one gets upset and causes tension and anxiety and conflict because you had sex with that young woman before you got married, or you were too mean to that person, then the ego has to deal with the anxiety and the regret or whatever that occurs in those cases, and likewise the ego has to deal with the anxiety or the tension or the conflict that occurs whenever the id feels that the superego has carried too much weight and exerted too much control over the moralistic, appropriate, correct, ethical behavior that the superego is pushing. So that what the ego does in order to deal with that anxiety and conflict and tension and regret and whatever that occurs from both sides of the triad here, it engages in these defense mechanisms. The biggest defense mechanism is repression. Repression actually underlies all the rest of them. Repression is all about shoving underground the thing that happened, or the feeling, or the thoughts, or the processes internally that are creating tension or conflict. You just shove it underground and you don't deal with it. The problem, of course, with shoving it underground and not dealing with it is that eventually it can come back and create problems, and nothing really gets solved. Sometimes often repression is okay in the short term, and if it's done to a little extent, for a little bit, it can work out. But if it's done long term and in a major way, it ultimately will create huge problems. Freud believed that in that unconscious part of the personality, it's like a seething cauldron of psychic energy. And that seething cauldron of psychic energy is constantly seeking ventilation. If we're constantly repressing things, then it creates more and more tension and more of a possibility that eventually everything's going to blow up in the face of the person and you have full-blown neurosis or mental illness. All the rest of these are just different forms of repression, and they can be used in different ways, but repression is kind of an underlying element of all of them. Let's talk about these in turn by looking at some examples. So again, when you look at this on your own, you can read this first one, read each one. First one says, parents might be reassured to know that children who pull wings off flies and jab pins in the dog may eventually find their niche in the areas of dentistry or surgery. So this is called sublimation. Sublimation is when you take an impulse, a tendency that you have that creates conflict or tension within your being, and you don't just repress it, but you sublimate it or channel it into an appropriate outlet so that it's not so bad. It's not such a negative, inappropriate thing. It's not okay to inflict pain on other people, to cut them up, dismember them, things. But if we channel those impulses into the areas of dentistry or surgery or boxing or hockey or football or any number of society deemed ways that are appropriate, then that negative impulse can not be a bad thing. It can work out and actually make you money, make you fame, gain you a sense of accomplishment, but through a channel that is okay. So all those examples where you channel an inappropriate impulse into an appropriate one are called sublimation. We'll talk about another example of sublimation in a bit. The father of an unwanted child may feel guilty for not loving his child. As a result, he may try to prove his love by becoming overindulgent and overprotective of the child. All right, so what this father is doing is he's feeling bad because he's not loving his kid. And I just want to point out that as a parent of 4 daughters, there are times when you're raising kids that you don't love them. And that can create tension and conflict and negative feelings. And so how do you deal with that? That's an issue that every parent is going to deal at some point. So what Freud said that you do when you have these kind of impulses is that you can go in the opposite direction. You can bend over backwards to do the opposite, to try to convince yourself that what might have been true in the past is not true anymore, or really not true. And also to try to convince, in this case, the child that you really do love them. So this is called reaction formation. In reaction formation, you do the opposite of an inclination that you're having, because to go in the direction and actually act on that inclination you're having would create more tension and conflict, so you have to go in the opposite direction. The problem with that is that it can lead to the child, in this case, feeling like you're not genuine if the child can tell that the parent really doesn't love the child, but acting as if he or she does, just because that's supposed to be done. Then the child can feel like, that's not really genuine, and the child may not be satisfied with those expressions of love from the parent. I want to point out that there are some interesting examples of reaction formation besides this. So when you're 11 years old and you like the person sitting in front of you in class, maybe it doesn't feel quite right to begin to act on that and to let that person or other people know that you like this person. So what do? Well, actually, let's take the boy example. What the boy may often do, especially, is pull the girl's hair, tease the girl, make fun of her. He's going the opposite of the direction he really wants to go, because he can't admit to himself that he really likes her. That would be your action formation. Another example of reaction formation would be the gay basher who actually turns out to be gay. Now, I'm not saying by any means that most people who are loudly and consistently antagonistic toward gay people are actually gay themselves, but there is some research that shows there is a sizable minority of gay bashers who are actually gay themselves. They're actually going against their inclinations in order to convince themselves and perhaps others that they're not really what they are, which is gay. The studies on this are done this way. They will take men and hook them up to indicators so that they know when they're sexually aroused, and they'll show them pictures of naked women and naked men and see which sex tends to arouse them more. And if you're heterosexual, obviously it's members of the opposite sex that are more likely going to arouse you. If you're homosexual, obviously, then it's members of the same sex that are more likely to sexually arouse you. And it turns out that there is a sizable minority of people who are, when they look at those who are antagonistic toward gays, there's a sizable minority of them who are actually sexually aroused by members of their own sex, which again suggests that they are engaging in reaction formation. Mrs. Brown often accuses other women of talking too much and spreading rumors. It's rather obvious to those who know her that she is revealing her own inclinations in that area. This is when you see in others your own faults. When you point the finger at other people, in a sense, in a way, to put the attention on them and not on you, maybe because you feel guilty and you don't want to acknowledge your own faults. And so you see them and other people and point them out at other people so that the pressure is off you and the focus is off you. This is related to it takes one to know one. Examples of this, actually this would be called projection. So when you're projecting something like, he or she is always talking behind my back about me and spreading rumors about me and saying bad things about me, when you're pointing that out about other people, it's possible, according to Freud, that you're actually projecting your own tendency to do that within yourself. I have to tell you that my mother-in-law, who's no longer alive, was the supreme projectionist. She had 8 children. My wife was the second to the bottom. And she spent most of her adult life with these kids doing things with them in a way that made herself look better. She manipulated her children's lives in order to make her look better. And it turned out that in the long run, what that resulted in is most of her children disowned her. One committed suicide. She would often, in her later years in Texas, try to make contact with kids who hadn't contacted her in years, and say, you don't love me, and you are talking bad about me and saying bad things about me, and I'm just neglected and unloved down here in Texas. And the fact is, the ironic thing about that is that the reason why her kids didn't really want anything to do with her is because she projected her tendencies. She did all these things I just described, but she was projecting her tendencies on her kids when really she's the one that was doing the things that she accused them of doing to her. All right, that's a pretty commonly well-known defense mechanism. Again, what Freud makes you do is he causes you to stop and think about why somebody's behaving a certain way. Why is somebody doing something? Why is somebody talking about somebody in this way? Is it because they're projecting their own tendencies on that person? Why is somebody behaving this way? Maybe because they're sublimating some inappropriate sexual or aggressive drive. Anyway, again, Freud caused you to think about the underlying things that are going on in terms of anybody's behavior in life. Okay, the habitual drinker may insist that he really doesn't care much for the taste of alcohol, but feels that he is obliged to drink just to be sociable. So, this person is rationalizing something that's not okay, telling himself, I don't really have a problem with alcohol. I just drink, when I'm with my friends, and I drink in order to be sociable. Now, this could be denial to a certain extent, but that's a little more extreme. When you're not really firmly and completely in denial about a huge problem, but you're explaining away something that's negative in a way that makes it seem a little better, then you're rationalizing. A student forgot that his dreaded final exam in geometry was scheduled for Friday. This seemed unusual as the date of the exam had been announced in class for the past 3 weeks. This is called repression. Now, we think of repression as something that underlies post-traumatic stress disorder. You repress the car accident you were in, or the combat traumatic ordeal you went through in Afghanistan or Iraq, or the natural disaster that you were involved in, the earthquake, the tornado. We repress those things, and then eventually they come back and haunt us because we didn't really deal with the issues. But repression can also be you're repressing that paper that's due in a couple of weeks because you need to concentrate on other things now. But of course, if you keep repressing until the night before it's due or the night that it's due, then you got a problem. So most of these defense mechanisms work to a certain extent, and they're okay to a certain extent. But when we carry them to an extreme, then that's when we develop mental illnesses and other related issues. Mr. James can't understand why his wife has been so grumpy and irritable for the past week. It certainly isn't his fault that she didn't receive the anticipated promotion at work. So she's being grumpy and mean and not so nice to her husband because of what's happening at work. She's displacing her anger and frustration that should be appropriately directed toward her boss or her employer or the system. She's directing it to her husband because he's an easier, safer target. If she directs her anger, animosity towards somebody at work, it's just probably going to make it worse. And so she comes home and treats her husband poorly because she's displacing the focus of her anger and her frustration. Something happens often. Again, Freud makes you think when somebody's being abusive to somebody else, to their kids, to their spouse. It may not just be just because that person's a bad person. It may be because that person is dealing with something in their lives, and this is their way of displacing their anger and animosity on a safer target. Mike is always trying to impress his pals with how strong and independent he has become. However, when Mike has social or emotional problems, he still wants his dad to figure out the solution. This is called regression. This is when you revert to an earlier form, a less mature form of behavior. You're older, more mature now, but you revert to an earlier form that used to work for you, even though you're older and you probably shouldn't really, as a mature person, be using this technique for dealing with the stress or the issues that you're dealing with now. A 2-3-year-old child may have kind of started coming out of the temper tantrums and become an easier child to deal with, and then the child gets a sibling, and now there's less attention directed to this first child, and so this first child begins to throw a lot more tantrums. That would be called an example of regression as well. John is apt to become annoyed when he recalls his earlier conviction as a peeping Tom. John has left his sordid past behind and now is a busy photographer for Playboy magazine. So it's not okay to be a peeping Tom, but it is kind of okay if you're a photographer for one of these types of publications. So he's sublimated his sexual drive into a career that he doesn't get thrown in jail for it. He actually makes money for it. Several years ago, there was a district attorney in Sacramento County who was the person to go to when you wanted to prosecute, if you're the state, you wanted to prosecute a person dealing in child pornography or something like that. There was a person kind of who specialized in that. And one day when he had a handyman at his home to work on some maintenance project, this handyman got into this district attorney's home computer, and he was probably just snooping around, and he found child pornography on there, and eventually he notified authorities, and they arrested this guy. They put him on trial eventually for dealing in child porn. The guy who was actually dealing with and trying to fight it was dealing with child porn himself. Now, he kept denying it and saying that he was using that child porn on his computer to fight some of the cases he was dealing with. And I don't really remember what happened to that case. I just know that it was appealed, and eventually it was resolved in some way because it's out of the news. But you could say that he actually went into child pornography prosecution in order to get his kicks. That would be sublimation. Or you could say that he went into child pornography. He went into the prosecution of child pornography in order to fight his own tendencies. He knew he kind of had that instinct, that tendency to be into child porn, and so he tried to go the opposite direction and fight it maybe nobly so, and maybe he ultimately lost that battle, but he fought it, was fighting it, and he was fighting it by going into the prosecution of child porn. So that would be called reaction formation. If you do the opposite of the way you feel, and what your tendency is, that's reaction formation, and maybe that's what he was doing. Or maybe he was actually using it as a cover to get into child porn. That would be sublimation. All right, here's another one. As a 6-year-old, Haley loves her dad and unconsciously seeks to have a relationship with him like the one she sees his mom having with him. Since she sees this as unlikely, she attempts to become like her mom in every way so that his love for Haley's mom will reach Haley indirectly. Okay, so this is called identification. Freud said that when children are between the ages of 6, 7, and 8, they begin to identify with their same-sex parent, as Haley is here. They try to become like that same-sex parent in every way and adopt their values and belief systems and gender role orientation. They do that in order to resolve the conflict that they feel because they're actually attracted toward their opposite sex parent. So the question is that really a thing? Now, this attraction toward their opposite sex parent is supposed to happen, according to Freud, around 3, 4, 5 years of age. For the male child, that's called the Oedipal conflict. The male child is attracted toward her mom, romantically, even sexually. Now, you have to understand that for Freud, and I'm trying to make Freud look a little better for some of you who really don't like this part about Freud's theory. Freud believed that kids are sexual. They're innately and naturally sexual, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just a natural part of their animalistic background. And so what happens when they're 3, 4, 5 years of age, particularly when they live in a heterosexual world, they're going to be having these feelings toward members of the opposite sex, and the most significant member of the opposite sex in their life, in a traditional family life, is going to be their opposite sex parent. And so they direct these newfound love/sexual feelings, romantic feelings, toward their opposite sex parent. And again, in order to make Freud look a little better here, he believed that sexual feelings were very broad. And so he described any kind of feeling of physical comfort, physical pleasure as sexual. And so when Freud said that these kids want to have a sexual relationship with their opposite sex parent, he was meaning to say that they want to have a cuddly, huggy, kissy, relationship with their opposite sex parent. They're not thinking they want to go to bed with their parents because they don't understand what that is at that point. But in the more general, in the way that a 3-year-old, 5-year-old understands sex, they want to have that kind of relationship with their opposite sex parent. Now, you can use the term Oedipal conflict for both the male and the female child, as most people do, but there actually is the Electra conflict, which is the specific term for the female child having the same attraction toward her dad. Now, some of you might ask, well, what if your mom or dad, isn't around? What do you do? Well, Freud would say, well, you find a substitute. The point is you have to find somebody to fall in love with, sexually, romantically, at a very young age. And you have to resolve that kind of conflict that occurs when you realize it's probably not going to happen in order to develop normally. And so if you're a male child and your mom is not around, you kind of want to have a romantic relationship with your dad's sister, your dad's mom, your dad's girlfriend, the preschool teacher, somebody like that. If you're a female child and your dad's not around, then you fall in love with your mom's brother, the preschool teacher, the milkman, the babysitter, whatever. The point is that you find somebody to fall in love with. Then you find somebody in order to become like. So you identify with a member of the same sex in your life in order to indirectly get the affections of the opposite sex member of your life. let's go back to the traditional family situation again. The male child becomes like dad in every way in order to have mom's affections. The female child becomes like mom in every way in order to have dad's affections. Now, again, some of you think that's really out there, and that's just crazy thinking. But I'm a parent of 4 daughters, and I have to say that each one of those daughters, when they were 3, 4, 5 years of age, they loved me differently than they do now. They kind of went through this period where they wanted to be a little more touchy, a little closer to me than I was comfortable with. And again, that was a phase they went through, 3, 4, 5 years of age. And after that, they kind of got away from that. When they got away from that, Freud would say what's happening there is they're identifying with their same-sex parent, their moms, in order to vicariously get my affections through their mom. So the idea is that if you can't beat them, join them. Since I can't compete with my mom for my dad's affections, since she's got him, then I'm going to become like my mom in every way. And if my dad loves my mom, then he's going to love me indirectly. And again, the boy says, I'm not really going to get mom because dad's in the way and dad's got her. But if I become like dad in every way, then I can enjoy mom's affections and she can love me indirectly through dad. Now, I want to point out that many young parents of young children will say that they acknowledge that their kids tend to want to break up when they're between the ages of 3 and 5 years of age. They tend to want to break up mom and dad when they're hugging and kissing. And they tend to say things like, I want to marry you, mom. I want to marry you, dad. These are things that most parents will say their kids go through, which suggests that they are acknowledging that Freud was onto something here. Now, Freud was kind of extreme and in his view of sexuality and his stating that these kids want to have a sexual relationship with their opposite sex parent. So that's kind of extreme, but he was onto something that most parents will acknowledge is going on. Now, if I made that sound a little more normal, a little more okay, I want to add some elements here that are kind of crazy, and most people will firmly criticize Freud for. Freud believed that young male children kind of have a fear of their dads at first when they're wanting to have mom in a romantic, loving sort of way. They know that dad has a temper, or he can sometimes get mad and upset, and he's big and strong. And so they become afraid of dad, and they're worried that dad might hurt them if they were to try to take mom from dad. And so one of the ways that dad could hurt them would be to get rid of their maleness, and that's called castration anxiety. Dad may cut off my penis and make me like my sister if I get in the way too much. So I don't want that to happen, so I'm going to get dad on my side by being like him in every way. And then I won't have to worry about being castrated. Now, how do I know that happens? Well, my sister doesn't have a penis, so maybe she made the mistake of trying to take mom from dad, and dad cut it off. Seems bizarre, right? And I agree, it is very bizarre. But Freud did believe that this castration anxiety was a motivating factor for young males to identify with their fathers in order to resolve the conflict that occurs when you're a young child and you are attracted toward, in this case, you're a young male child and you're attracted toward your mom. On the other side, females believe, according to Freud, that they're incomplete. They're missing something. They're missing a penis. So their motivation to become like mom is a way to vicariously get a penis through dad. And eventually what happens is if they resolve their Oedipal conflict by becoming like mom in every way, then they kind of get dad's affections through mom. And then later on, as they get older and they can have real relationships with somebody more their age, then they have a relationship with a male that's like their dad. And then if they have a child with that person, ideally that child is a male, or among the children that person has, there's a male, and now ultimately this woman now has three males in her life: her dad, her lover, and her son. And through those three penises in her life, she's now complete. So Freud called that penis envy. And of course, Freud's been widely criticized for that belief system and that idea. And it sort of suggests, not sort of, it really suggests that Freud was very sexist. And that's true, he was. You have to understand, though, that most people were sexist back in that era. And it could be that Freud was onto something here as well. And maybe, like Karen Horney suggested, Karen Horney is a neo-Freudian who's Freudian in her ideas and belief systems, but kind of makes them a little more palatable for the rest of us and makes them a little more modern and a little more acceptable by toning down some of the extremes. She said maybe Freud's onto something here, but what we really want is not the penis that the males have. What we want is the power, the status, the step on the higher hierarchy that males have. We want that. And that's the reason why we want to become like the males in our lives, the significant male in our life, become like our dad. We don't really want his penis, but we want the power and the status that he has. And that may be true. Anyway, the penis envy, the castration anxiety things, I think, are really crazy elements of Freud's ideas. But they stem kind of logically from some of the other ideas that he has that are really not that far-fetched if you think about it in a less extreme sort of way. It is true that kids are sexual. It's innate within them, and they do imitate and act on, the impulses that they have by in a way that they see loving partners react to each other and around them in their real lives. Let's talk about some other elements of Freud's theory. Freud believed that you can never really know the unconscious, but the symbols of a person's life can be used as a way to infer what's going on in somebody's unconscious processes. So when the queen goes into the king and says, "Good morning, beloved," at first glance that seems like a mistake. But for Freud, there's no such thing as a mistake. Everything means something. If she supposedly accidentally called her husband beheaded instead of beloved, she's actually letting us in on a little bit of her unconscious processing that's saying that she doesn't really like her husband and wishes he were beheaded. We call these Freudian slips. Freudian slips for Freud suggest what's going on in the unconscious mind of people, and they're indicative of where a therapist, for instance, needs to go in order to help somebody deal with their mental health issues. You need to explore the Freudian slips and the dreams and the other symbols of their lives in order to find out their ultimate meaning, and then in order to be able to work through them. So most people would say that Freudian slips do occur, and they do mean something sometimes. Sometimes they can be useful in looking at somebody's personality and hidden personality issues, but sometimes things are just accidental and they don't mean a thing. But you have to understand that Freud believed that everything means something. Every slip of the tongue, every dream, every symbol of your life means something. So you have to decide whether he's right to a little bit, right completely, or not right at all. I think he's right a little bit. Can Freud's theories be proven? So let's talk about one of the issues about Freud's theory that I've already alluded to. He's not very scientific. He's focusing on the cause of people's personality being their unconscious processes that are very hard to observe and quantify and measure and do research on. And so we would say that Freud's theories are very unscientific. Now, Freud, I think, would say, if he were here, okay, it's hard to study this scientifically, but we can't say that the unconscious is not important at all. We still have to acknowledge it and study it in some way. It's got to be part of our look at the human being. And so we'll just have to deal with the unscientific nature of it. And actually, I kind of agree with that. Just because it's not as scientific as behavioral processes and conscious thought processes doesn't mean we are justified in saying it's not important. It probably is important in some way. We just have to figure out how to incorporate it into our understanding of the whole being. But the problem is that if you can't prove something to be false, you can't prove it to be correct. And the problem with Freud's theories is you can't prove them false because they're about things that we can never measure or manipulate. So just to illustrate that, there's a Peanuts comic strip from years back. It goes like this. Lucy always wanted Schroeder to marry her. And so she was always coming up with the latest strategy to stop focusing on his piano playing and the major masters of piano, Beethoven and Bach and Mozart. And so here she's embarking on her newest strategy to get her to forget his music and marry her. So she says, I've just come up with the perfect theory. It's my theory that Beethoven would have written even better music if he had been married. What's so perfect about that theory? Schroeder asks. She says, well, it can't be proved one way or the other. So she's trying to make the point that since that theory can't be proven wrong, it's a good theory. I used to give quizzes that had short answers. Students had to write short answers to different questions I would ask. And one of the questions I would ask was, indicate a weakness or a strength of Freud's theory. And some of my students would inevitably say, even after I went over it in class, that one of the strengths of Freud's theory is that it can't be proven wrong. But I since then, I've incorporated this comic in my lecture to make the point that if a theory can't be proven wrong, it can't be proven right, and therefore it is not any good. So I think that's the biggest knock on Freud's theories, is that, okay, he's onto something in many, many cases, but it's a very unscientific kind of theory, and it just makes you think, which is good, but it gives us no definitive answers in terms of describing what human personality is all about. Now, that's related to a story. Again, Freud was into the symbols of people's lives. He had a sense of humor, too, and his sense of humor often was used to ridicule or belittle other people in a kind of a friendly sort of way. For instance, he often would point out the symbols of people's lives and say, you know what, you're constantly going like this with this pencil in your hand. And you know what that is, don't you? That's actually symbolic of a penis. Anything that's elongated is a penis to Freud. Just like anything that's kind of boxy is symbolic of a vagina. And so he'd say, you know, that's a phallic symbol. And so maybe we need to get you on the couch and examine, you know, your sexual attitudes and behaviors and belief systems and hang-ups and work through this so that you don't feel like you need to be going like that all the time. And if we do that, then maybe your sex life would be better as well. And then he'd laugh and they'd laugh and everybody knew that it was just a joke. But at some point, many of his friends kind of got tired of his sense of humor with them. And so they said to each other one day, okay, you know, we need to turn the tables on Freud. You know, he's always smoking this big fat cigar. So maybe that's a phallic symbol. We should ask him about that and see if we can get him on the couch and analyze that. So his friends go to him one day and says, hey, Freud, we think that you have some sexual hang-ups, so maybe we should analyze your sexual issues. And he said, famously, sometimes, gentlemen, a cigar is just a cigar. And the story ends there, and we don't know what happened, but, you know, it's possible what happened was Freud, they said, so you're telling us that if we're smoking a cigar, it's a phallic symbol, but if you're smoking a cigar, it's a cigar? And Freud would say, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Well, how do you know when it's cigar, it's when it's not, or when it's not? Well, I'm the expert, and I know everything that there is to know about people and how to analyze people, and so I figured out that for you, it's a phallic symbol, but for me, it's just a cigar. So basically, take my word for it. Why? Well, because I'm the expert. So if you can get into that, you realize that's pretty circular argumentation and not really scientific. Now, that story may not be true. It's unclear whether that really happened or not. But whether it happened or not, it's very indicative of the major problem of Freud's theory. it can't be proven wrong. Some people say that Freud tried to explain everything through unconscious processes. And in trying to explain everything from things that can't be observed or measured or manipulated, he ended up explaining nothing. Now, I believe he explained a lot of things, but I also believe that you can't really go to the extremes that Freud went in. Now, if we look at the legitimate strengths of Freud's theory, there is a unconscious. Childhood is important. Childhood does influence the rest of our lives in major ways. Sexuality is a huge part of our psyche and our personality. Repression does happen. People do engage in defense mechanisms, and getting people on the couch and talking to them through free association, getting them to freely associate everything that's going on in their mind and working on the issues that seem to arise to the fore, that seems to help people. Those are the strengths of Freud's theory, but the weaknesses of Freud's theory are basically the same. Now, in addition, the major weakness of Freud's theory is that it's unscientific, but the other weaknesses are that he focused too much on childhood, he focused too much on sexuality, he focused too much on the unconscious. He said everything comes from the unconscious, and every symbol means something, every dream means something. That's way too extreme. So his strengths are his weaknesses, except for the major one, which is that he's not very scientific. Now, if you were to ask Freud today, if he were alive today, how would you measure people's personalities in addition to and their unconscious processes, in addition to dreams and the symbols of their lives? He might come up with something called the thematic apperception test. Now, this was developed after he was no longer alive, but if he were alive then or now, he would use this to measure somebody's personality. You can't give somebody a personality test through paper and pencil, through some sort of Scantron test or multiple choice test, because that is measuring conscious, above the surface elements of people's personalities. You have to get underneath the surface. You have to get underneath the water. And so in order to do that, you do things like you show them an ambiguous picture and have them describe what they see in that picture. So what are the circumstances behind this picture? If somebody says, well, she just found out that her husband is having an affair and she's extremely depressed and doesn't know what to do. And so she's fallen down on the ground and leaning against the window seat. If somebody says that, then that suggests something about their personality. But if somebody else says, oh, she just found out that she won the lottery, and so she jumped up for joy and actually fell on the ground and came to rest on this window seat, that says, whoever says that suggests something else about that person's personality. Some people are more likely to say things about more like the first person, and other people are more likely to say things like the second person, and that means they have different personalities. The idea is if you give somebody an ambiguous image, what they say they see in the picture is an indication of who they are. These are called projective personality tests that a Freudian would use because it illustrates the fact that people project who they are onto the way that they view the world. Now, the most famous projective personality tests are Rorschach inkblot tests. This was developed after Freud died. But the idea is, again, if you show ambiguous images to people, they say things that they see, and what they say they see is an indication of their personality hang-ups, their personality issues, their personality tendencies. If you've never taken the Rorschach and you have an opportunity, I would take it. It's kind of a fun opportunity. I took the Rorschach when I was an undergraduate student because I was a subject in a research study done by my graduate student teacher who was studying the Rorschach test. And he would ask me, he'd look at the picture, he says, now describe what you see, and then I describe in detail what I thought I was seeing, and then he'd ask me to describe some more, look at a little bit different way, look at this part of the picture and that part of the picture, and he kept probing and probing over these 15 different ink blots. And then about 2 or 3 weeks after I did this, he came back with this detailed profile, and I was really impressed. I thought he did a really good job. Now, you have to understand that, like Freudian theory in general, there's no real kind of scientific proof that these things are valid tests, but they can be used as kind of like in an artful way. They can be used as a tool to gain some insight into people's personalities. If people tend to see more of these kinds of things, and people who tend to see those kinds of things tend to be more neurotic or schizophrenic or introverted or extroverted, then these kind of tests can be used as some kind of indicator of a direction that, as a researcher or as a clinician, you might go into a little bit more to explore a little more fully in order to diagnose a person. So they can be useful in some cases, but they're not really all that scientific. Okay, I won't spend as much time talking about the trait view and the other two perspectives as I did the Freudian theory. I spend more time on the Freudian theory because it's just more interesting, and there's just more to it. But we'll spend a little more time on the trait view than the other remaining two, but not much time on either one of the three. So the trait view, remember, is basically the biological view. It says that our traits come from our genes. They do studies on twins, identical twins who are separated at birth. They find that people who were separated at birth tend to be sometimes uncannily similar, even though they've lived in different parts of the country for many, many years before they even knew that the other one existed. All those kind of interesting things suggest that the trait theorists are onto something. They also do something called factor analysis statistically to show what traits tend to be most common in people based on people's responses to surveys and questionnaires in which they describe themselves. So there's a little bit of science involved in the trait theory that's not really involved in the Freudian theory. So that's one of the strengths of the trait theory. There's more science involved. They've been able to determine statistically what kind of traits are most common in people and develop tests around those. Their major emphasis is on the prediction of individual differences. Now, as we'll talk about in a minute, they don't do that great of a job of identifying people's individual differences because many of the tests that are developed, even if there is some science as a basis for developing some of these tests, many of the tests have not really been empirically studied and derived and created enough in order to make them really useful in diagnosis. But nevertheless, in spite of the fact that many of these personality tests are not good, some are, they should be given credit for the fact that their mission is to identify the individual differences that exist across the planet, and they do the best they can, I guess, in trying to identify those individual differences. Now, one of the things that they assume is that our traits are stable. If they're genetically determined, then they're going to be fairly stable. And I just wanted to have you think for a minute, if traits aren't stable, if they don't really stay the same in a person from month to month or year to year, or from this decade to that decade, then you might question the utility of using the tests that come from this kind of perspective. But nevertheless, that is an assumption that trait theorists have, and you can decide for yourself whether that assumption is actually correct. To the extent that they are stable, then, or stable long enough, for long enough periods of time that the test can be useful, then the whole theory, the whole trait view might be a useful theory of personality. Since there are not a whole lot of details that they can supply to the why, the explanation for where our personalities come from, it simply comes from our genes. Since they pretty much say that they come from our genes and don't have to add a whole lot to that, their emphasis is on description and prediction, the test that they've developed to study these individual differences. So Freud, if we go back to the first chapter, the goals of psychology are describe, predict, explain, control. Freud tried to do all of those things. Describe people's personalities, predict their personalities on the basis of the symbols in their lives, the dreams and so on, the Freudian slips. Explain their personalities, go into the Oedipal conflict, the Electra conflict, and the id, the ego, the superego, and repression and sublimation and all that. So he was definitely into description, prediction, and explanation, but also he was into control. He developed a therapy in order to deal with people's issues once he found out what their issues were. So Freud was into all goals of psychology. Trait theorists are really into description and prediction, not really into explanation. I mean, they have an explanation, it's biology, but not a whole lot to add there. And they don't have a therapy that's associated with their approach. So in order to describe people's individual differences across the planet, realizing that there's how many people on the planet? There's 8 billion, 7.5 billion people on the planet. It would be impossible to develop a test that would clearly differentiate between every single person on the planet. Everybody's different, right? But it would be impossible to develop a test that would allow you to see those differences across 7.5 billion people on the planet. So what they do is, rather than look at all of the individual minute variations that might exist across people, they focus on a limited number of dimensions. And again, factor analysis, that statistical analysis I mentioned earlier, that factor analysis has been used to determine what dimensions are best used to be able to describe the vast majority of people, how many of them there are, and what ones they are. So one example of a limited dimension, the limited dimensions that trait theorists have focused on in order to describe 7.5 billion people, is called the Big Five. So again, through factor analysis, they've determined that many people can be described in terms of where they fall on the scale of neuroticism, from low to high, extroversion, openness, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. So many personality tests are focused mainly on these 5 dimensions of people's personalities. Some other types of tests are developed on variations of these personality tests. So probably the Big Five is the biggest claim to fame of the trait view of personality. And many personality tests can kind of trace their ancestry through the Big Five, to the Big Five. As an example of a Big Five related, not specifically a Big Five test, but a Big Five related test, there is the Myers-Briggs inventory, or the Keirsey temperament sorter. You take the test and you respond to questions like this. If you take the shorter version, it may be just 50 questions or so. The longer version may have 250 questions. They're multiple choice with just 2 options. Are you easy to get to know, A, or hard to get to know? And you respond one way or another. And probably if you're taking the test, you're thinking, well, that's kind of hard to say, but I'm going to lean in this direction. And then you go to another question, and then you say, well, that's kind of hard to say too. I don't really know which way to go, but I'm going to lean in this direction. The idea is that when you respond to enough of these questions, which are similarly stated but slightly different, and cover a wide variety of characteristics and contexts and situations, and then you have supposedly a good feel for how people tend to be across many different situations, even if they tend to maybe be a little bit in the middle, but they tend to lean this way or that way. That's kind of the idea. So if you've taken the Myers-Briggs test or the Keirsey temperament sorter, you may know that it the dimensions that it uses is not really the big five specific, but they're similar. They look at how internal or external you are, how intuitive or sensing you are when it comes to understanding what the truth is about people or about the environment, how thinking or feeling you are in terms of how you process information, and how perceiving versus judging you are in terms of how you come to make decisions. So again, the test based on your responses will determine whether you lean to be internal or external, intuitive or sensing, thinking or feeling, and so on. So in the end, somebody might say, well, it turns out that the test results say that I am an INTJ, ESTP. I think when I have taken the test, most often I'm an ISTJ, maybe INTJ. I've taken it maybe 4 or 5 times, and once or twice I think it came up with a different diagnosis, but mostly I'm internal and intuitive or sensing, and then thinking and judging. And then what happens is once you get your label based on where you lean with all these questions, then you can read the books, publications that describe who an ISTJ tends to get along with, who they tend not to get along with, what kind of jobs they're most suited for, and what kind of jobs they're least suited for. So the test is kind of popular because it's used in relationships, it's used at work, it's used in groups to find out what the people are like that you may be dealing with and interacting with in the group. It's a pretty popular test, and I'm guessing that many of you have taken the test. It's a good example of how the trait view is attempting to describe a lot of people on a very limited number of dimensions. But it's also a good example of how difficult it is to describe the whole planet on such a small number of dimensions. If you look at all the variations, there's 16 different variations. You can be an INTP, an ISTP, an ISFP. There's 16 different possibilities. And that's pretty limited when you think about 7.5 billion people on the planet. Just to illustrate, and I'm getting into one of the criticisms of the test, of the approach to personality, there are studies that have been done where they do something like this. These people are in a large captive audience, and the teacher or the leader of the group says, okay, we're going to give you all a personality test. So they give everybody the Myers-Briggs test. Everybody completes it, and then the leader of the group says, okay, we're going to take these home, run them through the computer, and then bring them back next week when we meet again, and you'll get to read your personality profile and all the descriptions of who you would get along with and who you wouldn't, and so on, and what kind of jobs you're best suited for, and so on. And we'll let you share yours with other people and compare notes and so on. So everybody comes back the next time, and the first thing the researcher asks is, how many of you feel like after you read your personality profile, how many of you feel like this was a pretty good description of who you are? And generally what the research shows is 2/3 or 3/4, somewhere in there, would say, yeah, I think this pretty much describes me pretty well. And then the researcher says, or the leader of the group says, okay, now take yours and share it with the person next to you, because they haven't been allowed to do this yet. And you read your neighbor's and let your neighbor read yours. And you're reading that, your neighbor's reading yours, and pretty soon everybody's realizing that it's the same. And you start comparing notes with everybody across the room, and what you find out is that everybody's got the same personality profile. So they picked out one of them, and they gave it to everybody and said, this is your personality profile based on your unique answers. But 2/3 of the audience said that this was a good description of them, but then they find out it's also a good description of a generic person. It turns out that this kind of an approach tends to describe most people at least some of the time. And our human nature is to have a tendency to say, yeah, that's like me, that can be like me, that can be like me, that can be like me. And pretty soon we feel like, oh, this is a good test when and it really describes me, but it really describes me in general kind of ways that are true of most people, at least some of the time. So it's not really doing a very good job of describing individual differences. Again, that's the mission here, but because we're describing everybody on a very limited number of traits, we really can't do a fantastic job of describing the real minute individual differences in people. I would say that most trait theory personality tests are like the Myers-Briggs. They're interesting ideas. They can be useful. They can be helpful, kind of like the Rorschach test. They can be helpful in some ways, but they don't do a fantastic job of clearly differentiating between different people who take the test. And that's largely because it's hard to describe the minute differences of everybody on the planet in a single test. However, there are some tests, like the MMPI, this one in particular, which are very good. Let me go back. Now, the Myers-Briggs test was basically created in this way. These two people got together and said, after discussing and doing some research, they decided people tend to be either introverted or extroverted, intuitive versus sensing, and so on. Let's determine that these are the four major dimensions that people can be described on. And so, having done that, let's come up with questions that measure those tendencies. And so they come up with the questions, they threw them into a test, and then they started giving the test out to people, and people liked it. People started writing books about it and comparing their results with other people, and it pretty much becomes popular. But there was never any research to determine if people really can be described in terms of those four dimensions, if there's really only 16 major broad types of personalities, and if those questions that they came up with really are the ones that can legitimately be used to describe those characteristics. And that research has never been done. So in other words, we would say that the Myers-Briggs has not been empirically derived. It was just derived out of the creativity of some people's minds, with the Big Five and other theories as a basis. On the other hand, though, the MMPI is a test that was empirically derived. And it was specifically derived in order to make diagnostic decisions about whether somebody is neurotic or not, psychotic or not, hysteric or not, extremely introverted or not, depressed or not. And what they did is they came up with like thousands of questions. And they came up with these questions through clinicians who dealt with people who were psychotic and neurotic and introverted and hysterical, paranoid, depressed, and so then they started giving the test with all these questions to people who were known to be mentally ill or to have issues with depression and anxiety and psychosis and so on. And they found that some of the questions worked to differentiate between these people who were schizophrenic and these people who weren't, and these people who were depressed and these people who weren't. And they kept those questions in the test because they worked. They were useful in differentiating between people with different kinds of issues. And then the rest of the questions that didn't seem to be helpful in differentiating with people with different kinds of issues, they threw out. And through that process, and actually adding some questions in, subtracting, adding more in, subtracting, they basically found that, look, these 500 questions, and it's a very long test, these 500 questions or so that we have in here, these have each been looked at scientifically to determine if they're useful and valid in predicting people's personalities. And so we would say that test was empirically derived, scientifically derived, and can be very useful in diagnosis. This shows kind of a chart of what you can do with the MMPI. This shows that somebody took the test and was in kind of extreme ranges in a couple of these areas, and then the person went through therapy and took the test again, and the person tended to be a little less extreme in some of those areas. In other words, the person improved in these areas. They're able to compare a person with other people. They're able to compare a person with that same person in the past. And that kind of research, again, is scientific research that shows that this is a very valid test. Many of you will probably never take this test because it's usually only used in a professional setting when whoever is giving you the test really wants to know in detail about your personality and your issues in order to determine if you're fit to be hired by the FBI or the government in some sensitive position, or to be a foster parent or something like that. However, if you ever get a chance to take the MMPI and get the results, it might be kind of fun to get the results and see how useful it was in describing your personality. But it's not so much a personality test as it is a mental health diagnostic test, and there is a difference. You can have differences in personality, and none of those differences could be in the extreme range so that you would be diagnosed as being mentally ill. And many of the personality tests are really testing things like that, different tendencies, and not really mental health diagnoses. And this one is a mental health diagnostic test. Now again, the question is, are traits stable? So this little comic, Mr. Coughlin over there was the founder of one of the first motorcycle gangs. This is men and women in like a retirement home, and he's like 90, and he's riding this sawhorse like they're like it's a motorcycle. Apparently they're seeing that he's been kind of the same person from the age of 90 back to his 20s or teens. So is that really the case, that people are the same when they're 90 in comparison to when they're 20? I don't know that that's true. It could be, it may not be. But again, that's up for a debate. So I want to, on this perspective, I want to focus on the question of whether this focus on positivity, the human potential, and free will and self-determination, and the idea that humans will basically choose what's best for them if left to their own devices and not hindered by the environment, if that's really a valid assumption. Or are some people just evil, some people bad, or some people just inclined to choose bad things for them, to engage in self-defeating behavior? Humanists really don't have a way to explain that, because they just don't see that part of human nature. So this little comic has Satan talking with one of his minions in the underworld, in hell, and Satan says to his helper, his minion there, "We do pretty well when you stop to think that humans are basically good." So this is a comic knock on humanistic theory. Maybe that's not actually a valid assumption. Let's go back to the social cognitive view of personality. As I said at the outset, this theory is the most scientific because it focuses on more scientifically easily measured behaviors and cognitive processes, conscious cognitive processes. Things can be more easily manipulated and studied in a lab or in an experimental context, which makes this probably the most valid and the most scientifically desirable approach to personality. That's its major strength. Its major weakness, though, is that it doesn't really, in as detailed a fashion as we would like, describe how our personalities develop, and doesn't really give us major appropriate ways and valid ways to measure people's personalities. So probably the trait theory gives us the best approaches to measuring people's personalities, although some of them are good and some of them are not so good. Myers-Briggs being an example of those that are not good, the MMPI being an example of those that are good. The social cognitive theory doesn't really give us a whole lot of those kinds of tests. It doesn't tell us how the traits develop. Now, it does. Social cognitive view does talk about how our thoughts determine our behavior determines our thoughts, the environment determines our thoughts and our behavior. So there's this reciprocal relationship between all of these, and that's valid and valuable to know in some ways, but still there's not a lot of good research to show how that really works and how personality comes out of that. Most people would say that's not as detailed and not as well developed to help us understand personality as much as we would like. Freud's theory really helps us to understand personality because of all the elements that he put into it, but yet most of his ideas were very extreme and very much focused on things that are hard to measure scientifically. And humanistic theory doesn't really give us a really good picture of personality either, because it just focuses on the positive components of people's personalities. All right. Hopefully you can get more details about these from the book. And I'll see you next time.